Well, hello again, and welcome to another episode of Holding History. I'm excited about this one. We get to do another little dive into the history behind something, and this time it's going to be the Morgan silver dollar, perhaps the most collected United States coin that was ever produced. This is just a quick look at probably one of the better Morgans in my collection. This is a very early annex-graded Morgan dollar. An 1881 San Francisco issue, and this one is graded MS65 obverse and reverse with some nice proof-like fields there. But it's not so much about the origin of the Morgan itself, it's more the story of the two men behind the coin, or two men who were intimately involved with the creation of this coin. That would be Mr. George T. Morgan and the pair of father and son William and Charles Barber, and some of the other players. So in just a moment we will take a look, pictorial illustrated history, if you will, of the origins behind the Morgan dollar, and more so than that, just the rivalry between two very key players in about a half century at least of mint history. So we're going to call this Mr. Morgan versus Mr. Barber, a rivalry struck in silver. We'll begin the story in 1876, when the United States was celebrating 100 years as a nation. This is just a quick view of the gigantic Centennial Exposition that was held in Philadelphia that year. But meanwhile, over at the U.S. Mint in Philadelphia, there were several players that were already in place that would become pivotal to the changing future of the nation's coinage. The director was Henry Linderman, who was a medical doctor, politician, financier, and collector of extremely fine and rare coin specimens. And his chief engraver was William Barber. Unfortunately, no picture of him exists that I could find anyway. But his only real contributions to date had been the trade dollar design, which was basically a seated Liberty / Britannia hack job, in my opinion, and the adaptation of the seated design for the 20-cent piece, which, of course, as we all know, was a miserable failure as a coin. But the seated design had kind of been done to death, and it was obvious that new talent was needed in order to try and revitalize United States coin design at the time. So Mr. Linderman contacted his counterparts at the British Royal Mint, and a young man by the name of George T. Morgan was recommended to him. No images that I could find of George Morgan as a young man exist, But Mr. Morgan had a keen interest in American design, and his classical training made him a prime candidate for the job. So he was brought over as an apprentice, but he received a very cold welcome from William Barber and his son, then assistant engraver Charles Barber. They explained to Mr. Morgan that there was simply no space at the mint for him to work, which was probably true, but only because the Barbers had been allowed to use mint facilities for their own private business ventures for several years. So Mr. Morgan's first patterns were likely created at different boarding houses, which he was forced to call home for a while, until space could begrudgingly be allotted to him for his work at the mint facilities. 1877 would prove to be a very busy year at the Mint for both the Morgans and the Barbers. Word was circulating that an act of Congress was in the works that could result in the need for a new silver dollar design. So the engravers began cranking out a slurry of pattern designs. And if you've not explored pattern coins, I encourage you to. It's just a fascinating study of all the coins that could have been, but they were shelved and abandoned or altered for one reason or another. So at some point, Mr. Morgan had been introduced to a very young Philadelphia schoolteacher whose name was Anna Willis Williams. And he agreed with the artist who had introduced him to her that she had the perfect face for this goddess of liberty concept that he was trying to design. But Miss Williams was very shy and reluctant, and it took quite a bit of convincing to finally get her to agree to pose for his engraving, his artwork, because mainly she feared losing her job. Activity like posing for art was considered only something that was done by lewd women, and it was very unmodest at the time. But she finally was talked into it and agreed to do it. And what emerged from their sitting sessions, about 5 sitting sessions from what we can tell, was the basic design for the Morgan dollar. but most of those patterns, as you can see here, were denominated as half dollars. And also Barber threw together some patterns that were shown too, certainly. So both Morgan and Barber were working on some pattern coins. So in February 1878, the Bland-Allison Act was signed into law, and it required the United States to purchase $2 to $4 million worth of silver from private mines each year, and to coin that silver into dollar coins. So Mr. Morgan and Mr. William Barber took ideas from their best patterns and presented the final designs for approval. And the general consensus among employees was that Barber's design was the best, but Mr. Linderman had admired Morgan's work, and after all, he was director of the mint, and he chose Morgan's. And the Morgan dollars as we know them today began being struck only weeks after the passage of the act and were struck in the millions. 1879, though, brought swift change to the setup at the mint. In January, Linderman, who apparently had gone swimming and sunbathing, a true story, came down with a terrible cold and severe chills, as it is recorded, and he succumbed and died January of 1879. Then in August of the same year, William Barber, the chief engraver of the mint, also passed away. So at that point, Linderman, who was Morgan's main champion at the mint, was no longer there to put in a recommendation for him. So William Barber's son Charles was appointed to replace him as the new chief engraver, and Morgan took what was left, which of course was Charles's former position, assistant to the engraver. So that arrangement would not change for quite a number of years, actually from 1879 all the way to 1917. And most of those years was spent with Barber just submitting design after design and having design after design approved, doing commemoratives, and doing, of course, the dime, quarter, and half dollar obverses and reverses, for which his name is so famous. But most of Morgan's work went largely unnoticed. He designed some medals, I'm sure submitted some designs for other redesigns of different coins, but just nothing got approved. And I'm sure we can imagine why that would be. But shortly before Charles Barber's death in 1917, the two men did collaborate on one final joint project, and it was the 1915 Panama Pacific half dollar, which is shown here. Charles Barber designed the obverse and George Morgan designed the reverse. I think it's a very gorgeous coin. Certainly the eagle on Morgan's reverse borrows heavily from the Morgan dollar eagle, but still a nice design. So after Barber's death, Morgan was finally appointed chief engraver of the mint, but at the time he was quite old, about 72, and most of the nation's circulating coins had only just been redesigned the previous year in 1916, which of course is when the Mercury dime, the Standing Liberty Quarter, and the Walking Liberty halves all made their debut. But during his brief tenure as the chief engraver, and also an interesting article appeared surrounding the end of the Morgan dollar era and the beginning of the peace dollar era in 1921. Here in the article is pictured Anna Willis Williams, her youth faded certainly, along with the fresh-faced Teresa de Francisci, which was the wife of Antoni de Francisci, the sculptor and engraver who had just designed the new peace dollar that was about to come out, or had already come out. And Anna, who had resisted the notoriety of having been the girl on the silver dollar for so many decades now, basically told the reporter to get out of there, and she couldn't understand why anyone would care about a few hours of sitting she did 45 years before instead of her many years of contributions as a kindergarten teacher. Sounds like a pretty fun lady. So there you have it. We'll end it here with one more look at this, which is probably the best Morgan dollar in my collection. But basically, I just want to know, what are your thoughts? Was the tying of Morgan's hands by Charles Barber, so to speak, a great waste of his talent? Or do you think Barber's designs, which apparently have stood the test of time as well fairly decently, were good enough? And maybe, who knows, Morgan might have been a one-hit wonder with the dollar design. Who knows? But just curious what your thoughts are. And again, certainly appreciate you taking the time to watch the video. Thanks in advance for your comments. And just thanks for taking the time to explore a little history with me tonight. Thanks very much.